Well, hi, everyone, and thanks very much for choosing to watch this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about a novel approach to the problem of American political polarization. Now, this study employs a social representations approach, and what it highlights is a difference in national identity perspectives between the U.S. political left and right. It's a difference that correlates with and predicts effective political polarization. Now, you'll be aware of the growing polarization in the US. Its origins can be traced back to at least the 1960s, but polarization has accelerated significantly since the 1990s. This animation reflects the changing issue polarization in the American general public between 1994 and 2014. And this is where we were in 2017. We can only imagine that the trend has only continued. But Americans don't just disagree with each other about issues. They increasingly dislike those on the other side. They're what is referred to as being effectively polarized. This graph shows that not only did the percentage of Americans who have an unfavorable view of the other party grow in the period from 1994 to 2016, but now a majority have a very unfavorable view of the other side. Now, we've witnessed these feelings at the elite level. They're manifest in political and media rancor and in congressional gridlock, but they also creep into the everyday lives of citizens. Studies have demonstrated biases against the political outgroup in things like awarding jobs and scholarships and in the choice of relationship partners. Now, the mystery surrounding effective polarization is that it appears to operate outside what we commonly think of as ideology, i.e. the level of agreement on political issues. The researchers have found that self-categorizing as a Democrat or as a Republican, a liberal or a conservative is enough for us to dislike the other side, in spite of agreement on important issue stances. Now, these observations on the power of group membership are in line with social identity theory. Social identity theory revolves around the idea that it is our membership in social groups that shapes our behavior. And this theory posits that we naturally tend to categorize the world into in-groups and out-groups, and will strive to create distinctions between the two. We boost our own group and denigrate the out-group. Now, work on effective polarization that employs social identity theory has focused almost exclusively on this cognitive process. Now, although it plays an important role in APP effective polarization, this process is not the full extent of social identity theory. In fact, the authors of social identity theory recognize the process as a starting point only. It recognizes that the connection between our self-categorization and our political behavior is dependent on what we believe the meaning of those identities to be. The meaning or the content of a social identity can include the norms, the values, and behaviors associated with that identity. So, to build on the literature that's out there, the current study sought to identify meaning and account for its relationship with political behavior, particularly with effective political polarization. So, to identify meaning, we employed an epistemological approach that builds on the current literature's reliance on social identity theory. We employed a social representations approach. A social representations approach essentially recognizes the synergy between social identity theory and social representations theory. And we expand on this more fully in the paper, but the idea is that identity meaning is built through the shared common understandings of those identities. Understandings that are exchanged within and between groups and is located in everyday lay language. It recognizes that identity meaning is socially situated. It's constructed with the involvement of both the individual and society, and is subject to influence and change over time. It's dynamic. In our particular application, we're looking for what's referred to as organizing principles, the core meanings that liberals and conservatives orient towards and about which they take stances. Now, a good place to start when looking for shared common meaning is in the lay explanations of the phenomenon to be studied, in our case, liberal and conservative identities. So therefore, the inspiration for the current paper is a qualitative study in which 20 liberals and 20 conservatives were interviewed about their political identities. In this work, a clash of national identity perspectives was identified. On the conservative side, a perspective that we have termed national reverence, or NR, reflected a regard for the nation as a symbolic community. So in this community, it was important to revere the symbols, the founding myths, the perceived ideology, and the sacred texts of the country. On the liberal side, a perspective that we've called individual support instead sees the nation as a collection of individuals. Now, this perspective held that the realization of the individual's potential, which was key, can only be achieved through greater equality. So as a first step, we sought to operationalize these theorized principles. Some examples of the items that comprise the principles measures, both of which focus on the country, are here. The full scales are comprised of 10 national reverence and 5 individual support items. So the purpose of this exploratory work was to evaluate these principles of national reverence and individual support that we've operationalized. Specifically, are the principles distinct and reliable? Are they valid? Are they highly correlated with and predictive of ideological identities? And are the meanings drivers of political behavior? In addition, we also explored the assertion in social representations theory that the principles may confer particular worldviews. Right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation are 2 measures commonly agreed to measure core differences in the worldviews of conservatives and liberals. So we used a comparison to those. We conducted 2 studies of about 360 participants each. The first was restricted to only those who identified as either liberal or conservative, and the second included moderates as well. The participants were recruited using online recruiting site Prolific, and although they were more educated and less diverse and affluent, the sample was broadly representative of the voting public. So the results. Now, exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis supported the validity and reliability of the principles, and that they are distinct. Now, the dominance of national reverence that you see here in its explanatory power, this 52%, you'll notice continues throughout these analyses. Although individual support was significant throughout, it is national reverence that for both the left and the right drew the strongest support in opposition. And these measures were highly and significantly correlated with ideological identification, indicating that they can be regarded as reflections of identity meaning. The contribution of national reverence and individual support to the prediction of effective political polarization and voting behavior was significant and substantial. Even in feelings towards liberals that you see in the middle of the page here, the national reverence principle dominates with higher correlations in betas. And in the vote for Trump at the bottom of the page, we found an almost 5 times odds ratio, so a very strong association. And finally, the predictive ability of national reverence and individual support for these outcomes exceeded the contributions of RWA and SDO. In the paper, we also include incremental predictive validity comparisons that drive home the relevance of the principles over RWA and SDO. So this analysis indicates that the sentiments measured by right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation may be communicated in lay language through national reverence and individual support representations. So in summary, national reverence and individual support can be seen as operating principles of ideological identity. Now, the paper obviously draws conclusions that stem directly from these analyses, that that reflects the vernacular of these particular principles is clearly associated with political polarization and voting behavior. We also make a number of other observations in the paper, including things like asymmetries between the left and the right and elements that drive effective polarization. However, it's the strength of the measure of national reference, the representation of the conservative identity that melds political and national identity, and that particularly resonated with both sides, that I want to highlight. Now, this observation has a number of implications for the study of effective polarization and for political behavior generally. Well, in the first instance, the findings represent a research opportunity surrounding the alignment of the conservative identity and national identity. Now, these identities are anecdotally seen to have become more closely aligned over the same period in which polarization has also increased, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating in the 1990s, punctuated by events like the election of 1988 and 9/11. This alignment has, however, not been empirically tested, and so could be taken up in future research. But more broadly, for the political present and future, it's important to recognize that the alignment reinforces the conservative identity. National identity is one of the most accessible and powerful social identities in the influence of political behavior. Citizens for whom national identity is important, regardless of their political leaning, they receive cues that being a conservative is being a good American, and they'll strive to act in accordance with what they believe are the prevailing norms of national identity. The identity overlap also gives conservatives the power to shape the meaning of national identity. And inherent in the power to shape national identity meaning is the power to influence who is perceived as the outgroup. The corollary of a national identity anchored in conservative identity is a liberal identity in conflict with national identity. The consequence is that both the liberal identity and the related representations of equality and progress captured in individual support are positioned as being unpatriotic. So in conclusion, we must recognize the extent to which the strength and accessibility of national identity has been secured by conservatives. We can then better understand the mobilizing power they're able to wield and how this has played a role in the country's polarization. Now, national identity is a social identity common to all Americans, and the same mechanisms I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, that we behave in accordance with what we believe the meaning to be, and that this meaning is dynamic, are available to create change. I believe that's not only possible, but it's also important for the US political left to influence the meaning of national identity. Now, in their discourse, Democrats have little in the way of offering an alternative meaning for an American national identity, and they're often left to defend their patriotism according to the definition provided by conservatives. But the current study suggests that it may be in the interest of long-term depolarization and perhaps even electoral success for them to attempt to provide a definition of patriotism in their own image. Thank you very much.